There are uncomfortable truths that have been deliberately obscured by history. Truths that holy men understood with crystal clarity, but that subsequent generations allowed to disappear into forgotten archives. One of these truths was communicated with extraordinary clarity by St. Don Bosco, the one who became known as the dedicated educator of youth, the founder of the Salesian congregation, the man whose life was completely consecrated to the salvation of young souls. But his voice was not always heard with the attention it deserved, and in particular, his teachings on the true nature of Muhammad and on the spiritual reality of Islam were progressively silenced, forgotten, or deliberately suppressed by history. During his years of intense intellectual and spiritual activity, St. Don Bosco dedicated himself to understanding not only the Christian faith in its depth, but also the false religions that competed for the loyalty of human souls. He understood that to adequately defend Christian truth, it was essential to fully understand the errors that threatened it. And therefore he studied, with extraordinary intellectual rigor, the origins and foundations of Islam. What he discovered deeply disturbed him. Muhammad, Don Bosco explained to his students and fellow friars, was not merely a misguided religious leader or a sincere prophet who had gone astray. He was something far more troubling. He was a man whose life revealed a systematic pattern of dishonesty, unbridled personal ambition, and conscious manipulation of the people under his control. The scholars Don Bosco had consulted, reliable historical sources, ancient documents, contemporary witnesses, painted a portrait that was difficult to reconcile with the image of sanctity that Islam later created. Don Bosco revealed to his students that Muhammad had been born into ordinary circumstances, the son of a pagan father and a mother who had been raised in the Jewish tradition. But instead of inheriting genuine faith from either of these traditions, Muhammad had become progressively ambitious for power, wealth, and dominion over others. He had begun as a caravan trader, circulating along the trade routes of Arabia, observing the religious communities around him, Christians, Jews, pagans, and gradually assembling a scheme that would combine elements of all these religions in a way that would place him at the center of power. What Don Bosco emphasized with particular insistence was that Muhammad had consciously fabricated his purported divine revelations. The epileptic seizures he experienced, historically documented, he had reinterpreted for his credulous followers as visions of the angel Gabriel. A neurological illness had been transformed into evidence of divine communication. Don Bosco explained that this was not naivete or self-deception. It was calculated dishonesty, deliberate manipulation, conscious lying with the specific purpose of gaining followers and power. Don Bosco's study of Muhammad also revealed a disturbing pattern. The more resistance Muhammad encountered to his religious claims, the more violent his response became. Those who questioned him, who rejected his assertions, who refused to acknowledge his authority, these were often killed, their possessions confiscated, their families destroyed. The religion that Muhammad had founded had not grown primarily through genuine persuasion or authenticated miracles. It had grown through the sword, through threats, through the promise of plunder and power to those who followed him. Don Bosco observed that honest historians of the time, Christians who had lived among the early Islamic communities, Jews who had personally witnessed Muhammad's life, all documented the same pattern. A man driven by personal ambition, a man without genuine spiritual legitimacy, a man who had replaced truth with brute force. And yet over the centuries, this truth had been progressively obscured by Islamic apologists who rewrote history, who elevated Muhammad to the status of an unparalleled prophet, who transformed a man of questionable character into a figure of legendary sanctity. What Don Bosco also revealed was that the very doctrinal structure of Islam reflected the fabrications of its founder. The Quran, Don Bosco explained, was not a genuine divine revelation. It was a chaotic compilation of elements taken from Judaism, Christianity, and Arab pagan superstition, arranged in a way that served Muhammad's political and personal purposes. There was no theological coherence. There were manifest contradictions. There were anachronisms that revealed human fabrication, not divine inspiration. Don Bosco cited specific examples that his students should study and understand. In the Quran, the Virgin Mary is confused with Miriam, the sister of Moses who lived centuries earlier, an error that no genuine divine revelation would make, but one that a human compilation made by someone with incomplete knowledge could easily commit. The concept of Islamic paradise was described in terms of permanent carnal pleasures, a doctrine that reflected the worldly desires of Muhammad and his followers, not a genuine understanding of eternal bliss. The nature of Islamic law also revealed the marks of Muhammad's human mind. It permitted behaviors that Muhammad personally desired, the possibility of multiple wives, the legality of lying when one feared death, the permission for plunder, and the enslavement of infidels. These were not universal ethical principles. They were personal conveniences that Muhammad had codified as divine law. And his followers, without the capacity or perhaps without the will to question, had accepted them as divine revelation. Don Bosco also frequently referred to what he called the strategy of Muhammad, the way in which he had structured his religion to be expansionist, aggressive, and uncompromising. Unlike Christianity, which Don Bosco explained had grown through martyrdom, through patience, through the holiness of its followers, Islam had been structured as a system of conquest. The concept of jihad was not merely personal spiritual defense, as later Islamic apologists would attempt to reinterpret it. It was an explicit mandate to expand Islamic dominion through force, to subjugate other peoples under Islamic rule, to continually expand the borders of Islam through war. What Don Bosco revealed was that this aggressive structure was not accidental. It was a direct reflection of the mind of Muhammad, a man who had used religion as an instrument of personal, political, and military power. The religion he had founded would simply continue this mission through the centuries. It would always seek to expand. It would always seek to convert or subjugate. It would always seek to extend Islamic dominion over new lands and new peoples. Don Bosco also observed that the social structure of Islam reflected the priorities of Muhammad. Women were subordinate, frequently deprived of basic rights, often seen as the property of men. This was not accidental. It reflected the personal practices of Muhammad, who had taken multiple wives, some of them still children, and had established a pattern that his subsequent followers would continue. The religion he had founded simply codified in divine law what he personally wished to do. In Don Bosco's surviving writings, he repeatedly referred to the fact that honest history would reveal Muhammad as he truly was. Not a prophet, but an impostor. Not a saint, but a manipulator. Not a man chosen by God, but a man who had chosen himself and had convinced others to believe his fraudulent claims. And yet, Don Bosco also expressed frustration that this historical truth was often ignored or suppressed in favor of more sentimental narratives that presented Muhammad as a complex but fundamentally well-intentioned figure. What Don Bosco understood, and what he tried to communicate to his students in the church of his time, was that an honest understanding of the origins of Islam was essential for the proper defense of the Christian faith. If the church allowed falsified or romanticized versions of the story of Muhammad to prevail, it would be weakening its own ability to refute Islam. It was necessary for Christians to fully understand the dishonest nature of Islamic origins in order to properly defend the genuine truth of Christian revelation. Don Bosco also revealed that Muhammad had deliberately plagiarized elements of the Christian and Jewish faiths, altering them to serve his purposes. He had incorporated biblical prophets such as Abraham and Moses, but had reinterpreted them to serve the Islamic narrative. He had recognized Jesus as a prophet, but had denied him as the Son of God, thus adapting Christology to serve his own theological objectives. It was not genuine religious synthesis, it was calculated appropriation, intellectual theft, disguised as divine revelation. The most disturbing aspect of Don Bosco's teaching was his understanding that Muhammad had structured Islam in such a way that it would be virtually impossible to refute it from within. Any question, any doubt, was considered disbelief and severely punished. Any dissenting interpretation was suppressed. The religion had been structured to be impervious to rational criticism, to be resistant to questioning, to be self-preserving through force and intimidation. Don Bosco warned his students that understanding this was essential for them to prepare to defend the Christian faith against Islam. For while Christianity invited questioning, encouraged rational investigation, and offered coherent explanations for its doctrines, Islam operated through intellectual coercion, intimidation, and the suppression of criticism. Understanding this fundamental difference was crucial for anyone who wished to adequately defend Christian truth. Don Bosco also referred to the way Islam had expanded geographically, often through violence and military conquest. Lands that had been Christian, Palestine, Syria, Egypt, Asia Minor, North Africa, had been militarily conquered by Islamic armies. The Christian communities there had been subsequently oppressed unless they accepted conversion. Don Bosco observed that this was not the work of the Holy Spirit, that it was not an indication of divine truth. It was the work of human conquest, of political coercion, of military violence disguised as religious expansion. Don Bosco's teaching on Muhammad and Islamic origins gradually faded from Christian consciousness. In subsequent eras, the Church frequently attempted a more conciliatory approach to Islam. There were attempts to find common ground, to emphasize shared elements, to avoid language that might seem offensive. Don Bosco had warned against this approach. He understood that it was impossible to find common ground with a religion whose foundations were built on systematic falsehood. However, Don Bosco also did not recommend despising Muslims as individuals. He understood that most Islamic followers were born into Islamic families, were raised in Islamic traditions, and sincerely believed in what they had been taught. The problem was not with ordinary Muslim people. It was with the religion that Muhammad had founded, with the lies he had perpetrated, with the structure of deception he had built. Don Bosco recommended that Christians have compassion for Muslims living in ignorance, that they desire to convert them to Christian truth, and that they pray for their salvation. But this should be done with a clear understanding that Islam itself was a false religion born of fraud, maintained through coercion, and structured to resist the truth. Compassion for Muslims should never mean tolerance for the lies they had been taught to believe. The legacy of Don Bosco's teaching on Muhammad is that he offered a clear, brutally honest understanding of the true foundations of Islam. It was not analysis driven by hatred. It was analysis driven by love for the truth. Don Bosco understood that properly defending Christian truth required a complete understanding of the nature of Islamic falsehood. And he offered this understanding to his students and to the church of his time, with the clarity that only someone who had studied deeply could offer. The fact that this teaching has disappeared from modern Christian consciousness is a significant loss. Modernity preferred to embrace narratives about Muhammad that were more palatable, that avoided offending contemporary sensibilities, that emphasized mutual understanding and tolerance. Don Bosco would have seen this as a surrender of truth in favor of political expediency. Understanding what Don Bosco revealed about Muhammad is crucial for anyone who truly wishes to understand the nature of Islam. Muhammad was not a prophet who had grasped truths about God that Christianity had lost. He was an impostor who had fabricated a religion to serve his own purposes of personal power. And the Islam that resulted from this fabrication bore the marks of this dishonest origin. If Don Bosco could speak to modern Christians, he would probably say what he told his students. Understanding the truth about Muhammad is not a matter of hatred or intolerance. It is a matter of fidelity to the truth. And the truth is that the founder of Islam was a man who used deceit and violence to gain power, and who structured a religion that would perpetuate this pattern throughout the centuries. The silencing of Don Bosco's teaching on this subject represents a failure of the modern church to adequately defend Christian truth. By avoiding honestly confronting the fraudulent nature of Islamic origins, the church has weakened its own capacity to defend its genuine faith. Don Bosco had offered an alternative: clear understanding, total honesty, and a firm defense of the truth without hatred for those who had been deceived. This is the secret that Don Bosco revealed, and that the modern world has chosen to forget. That truly understanding Muhammad as he was, a manipulator, an impostor, a man driven by personal ambition, is essential to truly understanding Islam. And that this honest understanding is not only compatible with compassion for Muslims, but is in fact the basis for any genuine compassion, for it offers them the opportunity to understand the truth and to choose salvation through genuine Christianity,